Hello my friends and welcome to episode 2 of the Tolkien debate show, where today we have a really interesting episode, and it is actually quite different and a quite different format to episode 1, where we had more of a question and everybody gave their own viewpoints on it. But today we thought let's switch up a bit and go for a statement instead and just discuss around it, so we just try to make it more dynamic. So the statement for today is the cause of the Númenorian fall. And just the same as last week, we have my three co-hosts. Firstly, ImzoBud. Hello, my friend.
Hello, everyone.
And thanks for coming. And we are recording this before the first episode has come up, so we don't know who won the poll for the last episode, but we'll get up on that on episode 3. Next, we have Florian. Hello, my friend.
Hello.
Thanks for coming again. And finally, Lexi. Hello, my friend.
Hey, everyone.
So, just regulars from last week, and we're going to be just discussing what was the cause of the Númenorian fall. And just like last week, before we get into it, I'll do it this week, provide some context around Numenor. Maybe people who might not know as well, the Númenorian fall. So, as we all know, but I know this can also be linked into the Amazon show as well. So, but we won't be discussing around the Amazon show Lord of the Rings on Prime today. So, the fall of Numenor. We know that Numenor, I won't go into the early history of Numenor, but we know, for example, we got Elros, and then he had like Tarmaneld or so many other kings. You got the story of Eldarion and Durendis. I think that might be mentioned today, but that was around 700 of the Second Age, around that time period. And then I'm thinking we're going to skip to the Battle of the Gwathlo, where the Númenorians arrived and practically did save Middle-earth, and went up the River Gwathlo and basically routed Sauron's forces. So that happened around, you could say around 1600, around that time period of the Second Age. And then Sauron, he retreated, went back to Mordor presumably, and then he returned again later on in the Second Age and started attacking Númenorian cities and coasts, and he was renowned as the Lord of the Earth and King of Men as well. And then in Numenor at this time we have Ar-Pharazon, who is the king, and he is getting quite angry around this. So the forces come, Sauron gets captured, but he does this. We could say Sauron gets captured. I'm sure this will get discussed as well. Sauron does get captured by the Númenorians, but at the same time there is this there's this dynamic play at work with. Maybe Sauron did this on purpose because he wanted to actually try and deceive the race of men now as well, because he had a little rivalry with them because they came and saved the elves earlier in the Second Age. So yes, we have that as well. And then this is where the real corruption from Sauron begins in Numenor, where after being in prison he rises up the ranks in Numenor to closely basically the advisor of the king of Numenor, Ar-Pharazon. And one of the things that Sauron practically says is that is basically create this agenda against the Valar and actually maybe even attack Valinor. And we know this is the case as later on in the Second Age, which led to the downfall of Numenor, which is practically the Númenorian fall. We know that Ar-Pharazon sent an armada to Valinor, and I think to the Hill Tuna or something. That's just on the back of my mind. I'm not sure around that. But then yes, we have that. Then at the same time we have the political intrigue in Numenor, as we have the faithful versus the king's men, and that dynamic happening in Numenor. We've got, as if you watch the podcast, Imzo knows of Melkor worshipping, and that starts to creep up during this time period, and basically hatreds towards the Valar and the gift of life that was given to them, because the men started hating that they don't have immortal life, but this is actually potentially a gift to them. So yeah, and then of course we have Eru intervenes, and then we have the downfall of Numenor. So that is basically an overview and sets the stage for what we're going to be discussing today. What is the cause of the Númenorian fall? And just like last week, we have Lexi starting us off. And I hope I did a good job in describing all that.
No, thank you. I think you hit the points pretty well. I think that gives everyone a good groundwork from which to go on.
Thank you. So yeah, go away with it.
All right. So my stance on the fall of Numenor and why things go down the way they do, literally go down, no pun intended, but I'll take it where I find it. Essentially is that, we blame Sauron a lot. It's easy to blame Sauron. Because of course he comes in and lies to the king and incites him toward open rebellion against the Valar, which does not end well either for him or for his country. But I really don't think he would have been as successful if there hadn't already been the conditions in place that not only invited the Númenorians to become corrupt to that degree, but almost in a way predetermined that at some point they would do something to a similar degree of, challenging the powers that be in the West. So we know that from even a couple generations after the first king, Elrostar Miniator, there's already political dissent in Numenor, there's disagreements, there's restlessness. We have the case of Aldarion and Arendis, and I won't get into their whole long sordid history, but it's, far from this paradise where everyone is in agreement and everyone, understands the will of Eru and the will of the Valar and is content with their lot, essentially. And these problems just get worse even before the Númenorians really get involved in Middle-earth. Part of that has to do with the fact that they've been essentially given the ability to gain power and knowledge at such an advanced rate, and then there's really nothing to check that. There's, they can expand eastward as far as they want. There's this arbitrary rule keeping them from expanding westward that eventually, they're going to have to start chafing against. And it's almost like after they defeat Melkor, Morgoth, and sort of leave, the Valar create this power vacuum that the Númenorians have to fill. So really, you kind of wonder, Sauron lies a lot to them about things that he presumably has knowledge of. For example, Sauron claims that Eru doesn't exist. He's just a figment of the Valar's imagination, a convenient figurehead, and presumably if, all of the Silmarillion and the histories and the writings of the Lord of the Rings are correct, that's not true, and Sauron knows that that's not true. But is he really lying about things like the Valar don't care about Middle-earth? Because really, I don't know, from a human perspective, if you can argue that they do. They don't really seem to. So that's kind of where I'll start it off, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's very true perspective that of course not Sauron didn't just single-handedly turn Numenor from like a good, faithful society into like evil and Valar hating, with the political parties around like the Kingsmen and the faithful who wanted to stay with the allegiance to the Valar and to the elves. That was like over 1,000 or around 1,000 years old already when Sauron arrived. So there was really this cultural shift as the Númenorians colonized Middle-earth more and more and sailed to north and south and east and basically discovered everything and increasingly conquered everything that they could, except they still fought against Sauron, but basically contained him pretty well. And so there was, of course, this growing restlessness. And I think the Númenorians, they already resented death largely, like their whole religion that was centered around Eru, and that death was a gift. That was a good thing that had already been in decline. Like the king stopped going to the holy mountain, and basically, the religious ceremony, I think it was barely done at all in the end. So there was really like this huge cultural shift already when Sauron arrived, and the men already kind of believed they could become immortal if they sailed west. It's just that the main problem was that it clearly wasn't a good idea because they would lose. Not the men weren't just, oh, we can't do it, it's forbidden, but like some might have wanted to, and they just clearly knew that they wouldn't have a chance against the Valar or even Eru himself. And Ar-Pharazon is mostly just delusional for thinking he has a chance, not just like the whole misconception that they could gain immortality is probably pretty widespread. It's just that Ar-Pharazon is so desperate about not dying that he actually attempts or deludes himself into thinking he has a chance of defeating the Valar.
Well, so you guys just gave the two opposite opinions. I think the one that defends them and the one that summarize how they felt. I'm gonna propose a bit of understanding their position. So the Numenorians, they are functionally the superior men. They live longer. Erendis has a beautiful quote about this. She says that they are basically half men. They have everything they want. Their land is an earthly paradise. They don't feel sickness, but they still die, and that's the gift of death. The gift of death in Tolkien's world is something that it's very hard to wrap your head around it. Like for elves, it seems natural. It's the way things are. They live forever, we die. But from our perspective, this idea that we are guests, even though, and again, put yourself in the position of Numenorians, they are the ruling power in Middle Earth. They are the ones who they are bossing everyone. They saved the day. They butchered Sauron multiple times. So this idea, when you have so much power and you still feel you are still functionally inferior to those you protect, it's kind of hard to not fall into to not be bitter about it, and you will steadily descend into hatred. And there is that theme in talking about the corrupting power, the corrupting power of power that is redundant. But that's the idea I got about them. From their own perspective, they feel like they are they are limited by the others. The elves still look down upon them, although they saved them multiple times. They don't get what they think they deserve, and that's, in my opinion, something that's played a big part into their fall. Then there is the political shenanigans, the Kingsmen and the faithful, and ultimately when Sauron comes, Sauron doesn't, as Florian said, and as Lexi said, Sauron didn't invent the fall. He did engineer it. He simply used something that was existent, and this seed of corruption and of evil, it was laid down by the Valar and not necessarily consciously. The Valar didn't mean for them to become like this, but it's like everything. It's a result of the marrying of Melkor. Like their death, they fear death naturally, and you cannot explain to them that death is the gift. They have been permanently marred by Melkor. They are completely fallen. They can't understand this. So when Sauron comes, he promises them immortality. He promises them, I want to say equality, because that would make it too modern identity politics. So we skip. He promises them he gives them what they want. What they want. He shows them. He talks to them about Melkor, about the God of Darkness, and how he will lead them. And that's what they want to hear. They don't want to hear that no, they are lesser because Eru decided it. No, they can't go to Aman because they can't. Because if they go, they will wither away and they will die swiftly. And if they decide to stay, their body and their spirit will be in conflict. That's not what they want to hear. They want to hear that they are special, that they are the true chosen one. And Sauron played them like a fiddle, so much so that when they invade, I don't think that they were that they thought they were gonna lose. I generally think that they were so much into it, so much coated into the hubris and arrogance that they genuinely thought they could overthrow the Valar, because for them that's the as I said, they were in Middle Earth. They ruled everything. They had just 100 years ago. They had just brought Sauron to his knee. So they were the absolute lords of Middle Earth. For them, they the idea that they can lose just didn't cross their mind. That's just me.
I'm really glad that you brought up the bit that Arendis says to her daughter. It's like, I think that kind of sums up a lot of the problems Numenor faces, because what Arendis said, as you mentioned, Emzo, was that the men of Numenor are they're not men and they're not elves anymore. They've been given this expanded lifespan by the Valar, presumably as a reward for their help to the Noldor in the First Age, which is odd if, the Valar are arguing that, oh no, death is a gift and you should be happy that you get to leave this world. Well, then why are you rewarding me with the ability to postpone my own death? That doesn't, from a human perspective, if death is so great, then why was my reward that I don't have to deal with this? And then the other thing that I think you mentioned is that they're lords of Arda. Essentially, they have more physical military power than the elves at this point. The elves kind of rely on them to help protect their lands from Sauron, and they've run out of things to do. And for me, it's very strange that, having seen a lot of this play out before, of course, in the Years of the Trees, with the Noldor getting restless and sort of getting bored in paradise and wanting more than what their station allowed, essentially. It's very strange to me that the Valar, of all people, knowing that Morgoth's taint infiltrated all of Arda and that eventually, all things would turn to corruption, they would decide to increase the power of the Númenóreans so much, just enough that they would, not really face any serious obstacles of their own, and eventually they'd get bored and have to start making their own problems, really. Having lived in a land that was fertile and being without disease and, having beauty and strength and wisdom and power, eventually they ran out of problems to solve, and they decided to just try and solve the problem of death itself. And I don't understand why more people didn't foresee that earlier, I suppose.
I think that in defense of the Valar, maybe like they kind of, or they anticipated it. There was the elves, the two from Valinor, there was this one messenger that told the Númenóreans, like, you envy the elves, but the elves envy you. Like, this, it's not about one fate being better than the other, it's just that everyone wants the thing that they can't have. Like, the men, of course, they die. They're on their own pretty quickly compared to the elves, but in the end, the men were promised to live beyond the world and to get to recreate it in the end, while the elves were like, they live until the end of the world and they have no real assurance what happens after. They only have hope that they just don't get erased out of existence once the world ends. So they try to explain it, and I think there's just not much that the Valar can do. Like, they can't if they just let the Númenóreans come to Valinor, the Númenóreans will just die there even more quickly and will become even more jealous and unhappy because they only have 100 years to spend in paradise, while the elves and Valar to them seemingly live forever. It's not forever, but from their perspective, basically forever. And the men will, like, the only options are either the Edain die out, or they eventually, even Sauron rules Middle-earth because the elves are fading, or the men become so powerful that they will eventually maybe grow to this kind of might where they fall. Like, I think Mandos is said to know a lot about the future, and maybe he doesn't really, I don't really understand what will happen, but I think they can guess that there's not really a way to prevent it. It's more maybe the major failure maybe is that the Númenorians are so a bit isolated from the elves, maybe. Like some elves visit the island, but maybe it would have been better to keep the men in Middle Earth to really live with the elves of Middle Earth. And but in the end, I think there's not much the Valar could have done to prevent the whole fall, because in the end the men just they had this tradition, this religion about Eru, but the teachings of it are so like they go a bit against human nature, maybe, or what human nature became after the marring of Melkor, to have faith and don't just lust for worldly power and goods. That's just something that would maybe inevitably corrupt men, like it did a lot of men in the East who never really got to know the elves.
So I'm going to say something a little bit controversial, and obviously this is nowhere directly supported in Tolkien's writings, but I'm developing this theory over the past week or so that I've been thinking about this, that the Valar did know that, essentially some sort of fall of Numenor was inevitable, and they decided to create Numenor, not anticipating that it would ultimately be a permanent thing, sort of anticipating that it would become corrupt and eventually have to be destroyed in one way or another. I don't think they maybe knew the specifics, but they knew that trouble would eventually rear its ugly head. They went ahead and did it anyway, because they knew, like Florian said, that they were going to need to preserve the Edain so that Middle-earth had a chance against, again, presumably they didn't know that it was Sauron himself, but the continuing influence and servants of Morgoth. It's clear that they did know that Morgoth's influence and his servants were still active in Middle-earth. They were a threat to the elves. They were a threat to the men there. Most of the men there were corrupt. So the Valar knew that they had to, in the short term, preserve the Edain, build them up to a vastly powerful force, knowing that they would morally at some point decay and have to be dealt with, but confident that, being the Valar, they could just solve that problem, cross that bridge when they came to it. Which I guess is great for the perspective of Middle-earth as a whole, but kind of is lame if you're like a man of Numenor and you know that your society's been set up as sort of this elaborate, I don't know, scapegoat or sacrificial item. But that is a very heterodox opinion. So
I mean, it's kind of, I think it's kind of true, but just that the fate of men is ultimately not governed by the Valar. Like, they don't really understand them, and they can prolong their life, but they can't just. Yeah, the men are so different from the Valar and the elves that they just have to accept that it's somehow part of Eru's plan. Of course, in the end, they don't really deal with men. They just they try to intimidate them, but ultimately they call on Eru and let him deal with the thing he made. So I think the whole men, I would have put it more at the feet of Eru himself than the Valar.
Well, I think we've entered the domain of criticizing the Valar's thought, which brings us back to the previous episode when I argued about Mandos. But here in this part, I still think that since we have Manwë in charge, I don't think they would be this pragmatic, and because what Lexi described is it's not fitting with the angelic god they're supposed to be, and they are. And as I said last time, the Valar, with the exception of Mando, they have the excuse of not being omniscient. From their perspective, I think that they were just I would argue that they were they wanted to mend their wrongs because if we go by Tolkien, whether by Tolkien's later revisions or by the early versions, the Valar didn't care about men when they awoke. They left them to deal with Melkor with their own hands. So I think this gift of Numenor was a kind of a good gesture to sort of apologize to them. and that's the spirit with which they went, which explains why they didn't deal with them so harshly as they did with the Noldor, for example. The Noldor, for example, with Fëanor, they exiled him. When he drew his swords onto Fingolfin, they exiled him immediately. But with Numenor, I think they had this sort of guilt for not acting and for letting men suffer so much, whether it be 500 years or over 2001. So that's my view on the matter.
And Imzo, before you leave, just because we're wrapping up now, what is your final statement on this ironically statement? So what's your final closing thing?
The Númenorian fall was a foregone conclusion. It was from the project couldn't have succeeded in the other knowledge because the seed of evil was always in them, and when you see the position, it was impossible for them not to succumb to the temptation. So I don't think we should be too harsh on them, and I also think that the Valar leniency towards them can be partially explained with their previous actions towards men, a certain desire to do a good gesture again, to act good and this time to help. So that's my thought upon it.
Yeah, and I think after this we can do a poll and having all these different. Maybe we can have the Valar, then we have Eru. Maybe like we want to have the Númenorians themselves as well. But Lexi, what's your closing statement, final thing on this?
So my So my final statement would probably be that as much as Sauron would love to take sole credit for single-handedly corrupting the mighty Númenorians, like Imzo said, it really was a foregone conclusion. Really was due to a number of factors, including, yes, the corruption of Morgoth and Sauron's machinations, but also just the nature of men, the nature of Arda, and a whole host of political and social factors that kind of led them inexorably down this path. And again, before we're too harsh on them, remember Arwen herself, when it comes time for her to die, she says, I never understood the plight of the Númenorians before. Now I think I do, because, to have a great life, to have potentially a lot of great life, and then have to face the choice at the end to voluntarily let all that go for some sort of mysterious afterworld is quite daunting to her. And she's, a descendant of Luthien and Elrond's daughter and all that, so presumably she knows what she's talking about. I will say that the Valar, being these immortal and very highly intelligent beings, although not omniscient, for them to not have foreseen this would make them intolerably idiotic. I think they probably knew and decided that it was on the whole better for Middle-earth, but that at some point Numenor itself would have to be sacrificed as sort of a pawn, again, for the sake of the, quote, greater good. But I mean, that's just me.
Yeah, and finally, Florian.
I think I largely agree. Just it's not like maybe the Valar just as they always did. Like they did intervene then to give the Númenorians the island, and it's of course all important in a great big picture point of view, because it preserves the Edain and the bloodlines that mix elf and men, and even a bit of Maya blood. So that's like the important purpose of the elves, of course, to ennoble the humans through teaching and through their offspring. But like the Valar aren't that maybe planning so much. It's just that they have to they try to steer men a bit eventually, or try to guide them, but ultimately they're Eru's creatures, and they just have to accept that the men are eventually going to decide the fate of Middle-earth, and it's not really their place to intervene anymore. At least it's Ulmo may intervene, because he always does, he never stops, but Manwë and the others, they just have to accept that it's not like they are just using pawns in a game, but the pawns just they have to let the pawns decide their own moves, because they're not in charge anymore. That's just how the world goes.
And I think the one thing that I can take away from this is that there are so many different factors that play into this. There's one of the biggest and catastrophic events in the course of the timeline of Arda. Maybe the sinking of Valerian is, of course, arguably. Maybe that could be another debate, but I think it is Valerian sinking. But overall, there will be a poll on my Twitter, so you can vote there for the viewers at home. Well, from what you think, maybe after listening to all these lovely people, maybe your opinion has changed as well. But that's just wraps it up for episode 2. Thank you, Lexi.
Yep, thanks for having me on. Had a good time.
And she is Girl Next Gondor, and all her links will be in the description below, YouTube, etc. Also, we have Florian. Thank you for coming on, my friend.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad to be here.
And looking forward to next week as well. And finally, Imzo.
Wow. Thank you for just using the
What noise is that? Sorry, continue.
statement. I
Yeah.
think that if we are in all objective, communism is the cause of Numenor fall.
Maybe, who knows? Maybe that could potentially be. I won't put that in my poll probably because Twitter would probably get angry at that. So they'll find a way. But thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. See you guys next week with another debate on Tolkien's works. But until the next video, my friends, goodbye.